is a place in the Balkans that looks so much like Middle-earth that it could easily become an inspiration for Tolkien's epic tales. It's also home to one of the last true primeval forests in Europe, a place where the trees are so dense and the cliffs so steep that parts of the country remain virtually untouched by the outside world for centuries. I'm, of course, talking about Montenegro. Long before the country had a name, before it had a flag or a king, or even a clear border, this land was already a crossroads. And who was here first? That would be the Illyrians. They were a mysterious people whose origins historians still debate to this date, but whose blood, some say, still runs in the veins of modern Albanians. Then came the Greeks. They planted colonies along the coast as early as the 4th and 5th centuries BC. After them came the Celts, then Rome, which finally absorbed the whole region in 9 AD, folding it into the province of Illyricum. Okay, so what else did Rome do? Well, they built roads and cities. One of them is called Doclea, or Duclea. It's near what's now Podgorica, and it grew to house nearly 10,000 people. Honestly, not bad for a mountain territory. But the inevitable happened. Rome fell, and when it did, the Goths took over, then the Avars. Then, in the 7th century, the Slavs. They're the ones who stayed. So these South Slav settlers organised themselves into tribes, each led by a Zupan, which was kind of like a chieftain. Here's the thing though, they weren't necessarily unified, and they weren't powerful either. But hey, they were here, in some of the most unforgiving terrain in Europe. That terrain, it would eventually become Montenegro's greatest weapon. Before we get to that, let me tell you something pretty interesting. The first real state to emerge from this landscape was called Duclea, which they later renamed Zeta. By 1077, it had grown bold enough to declare itself a kingdom, recognised by none other than Pope Gregory VII in Rome. A few years later, Zeta fell under the Serbian Nemanjić dynasty, which turned it into a medieval powerhouse. But when that dynasty collapsed in 1355, everything splintered, and right on cue, the Ottomans arrived, which, let me tell you, was like watching a novella come to life. See, in 1389, at the Battle of Kosovo, the Serbian prince Lazar fell to Sultan Murad I. It was a turning point that saw the great Balkan powers begin to crumble one by one. But while the lowlands fell, the people of Zeta did something different. They retreated. They moved deeper into the limestone peaks, led eventually by a chieftain named Ivan Crnujevich, or Ivan the Black. Then, in the 1480s, with the Ottomans closing in, Ivan abandoned his low-lying courts and moved his capital to a hidden mountain plateau called Cetinje. There he built a court and founded a monastery that would become the spiritual heart of the nation. And in 1493, his son Juradi imported a printing press from Venice and produced some of the earliest books ever printed in the Cyrillic script. It was also around this time that Zeta began to be called by a new name, Montenegro, aka the Black Mountain, and you'll see why later on. For now, let's get back to our story. Because in 1516, the last of the Crnojevich rulers stepped back and handed power to the Vladikas, the prince-bishops of Cetinje. This was the moment that changed everything. Okay, so watch closely because I'm going to give you a quick rundown. Montenegro became a theocracy, a prince-bishopric. A church and state fused into one, and because the Vladika commanded both the sword and the cross, the Ottomans ran into a problem. In other places, you could bribe a prince or strike a deal with a king. But how do you negotiate with a population that sees surrender as a sin? You don't. So you find yourself faced with people who aren't just defending a border, they're defending their soul. And that is a population that simply refuses to break. But despite their efforts, in the end, Cetinje was captured in 1623, and again in 1687, and again in 1712. The Ottomans kept coming. At the same time, Montenegro kept standing back up. Actually, there's a phrase from this era that kind of captures everything perfectly. A small army is beaten, a large one dies of starvation. Basically, what that means is, as I said earlier, the land itself was Montenegro's greatest weapon. It created a no-win situation for the Ottoman Empire. Because, if they sent in a small group of soldiers, the local mountain tribes would just pick them off in an ambush. But if they sent in a massive, powerful army, there was no way to feed them. I know. Apparently the terrain was so rocky and barren that there weren't enough crops or supplies to go around. So a large invading force would eventually run out of food and collapse before they could actually conquer the territory. However, rugged isolation could only take them so far, and by the 1800s, Montenegro was modernizing. Tribal feuds were suppressed, a legal code was introduced, a newspaper was launched, and in 1878, after joining Serbia and Russia in a war against the Ottomans, Montenegro finally got what it had been fighting for across centuries: to be recognized internationally for its independence. It even won back access to the sea after a really long time. Then came the 20th century, and it was brutal. Picture this: 2 world wars, the end of the old Montenegrin monarchy, a gritty resistance against Italian occupation, and finally the rise of a communist hero named Tito, who folded Montenegro into the new socialist Yugoslavia. For decades, it worked. But when Tito died in 1980, the glue holding the Balkan states together began to dissolve. Slowly at first, then all at once. Slovenia left, then Croatia, then Bosnia. Montenegro stayed joined to Serbia for one more decade. But in 2006, they held a referendum, in which the majority voted for yes. And on June 3rd, 2006, Montenegro finally became independent. It was the birth of one of the world's youngest nations, and also one of its smallest. But don't let the map fool you. Montenegro covers just 13,810 square kilometres, which is like 5,332 square miles. But within that tiny footprint, you get a bit of everything. In the south, you have nearly 300 kilometres, or 183 miles, of Adriatic coastline, crystal clear water, centuries-old stone towns, and the Bay of Kotor, which is a winding bay known for its dramatic fjord-like scenery, steep limestone cliffs, and rich history. It's also, fun fact, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Move inland and the coast gives way to fertile plains along the Zeta River Valley, the same plains where Illyrians, Romans and Slavs all chose to settle. So, doesn't that make you wonder why? Why did so many empires decide to stay here? Well, it was actually for the same obvious reason: good land, good water, good life, which is a complete contrast to the landscape up north. That brings us to Dormita, another UNESCO World Heritage Site defined by jagged limestone peaks, ancient forests, and 18 glacial lakes known locally as mountain eyes. For a long time, Dormita's own Bohbototovkuk, at 2,523 metres, or almost 8,300 feet, was celebrated as the roof of the country. But modern GPS measurements settled a long-standing debate. The true highest point in Montenegro is actually Zlakolata. It sits further south in the Prokletiye range, towering at 2,534 metres, or 8,313 feet. And cutting right through the heart of the north, that's the Tara River Canyon. It's a literal scar in the earth and the deepest canyon in Europe, plunging at 1,333 metres, or over 4,300 feet, down to the turquoise water below. Then there's Skadar Lake in the southeast. It's the largest lake in the Balkan Peninsula. Here's an interesting tidbit for you. It's home to over 270 bird species, including the rare pygmy cormorant, the Eurasian spoonbill, and the lake's unofficial mascot, the Dalmatian pelican, one of the largest flying birds in the world. So if you're a wildlife person, this place is as good as it gets. But it gets even better, because I'm linking all the travel essentials you need in the description below. Now you'll be ready for whatever nature comes your way, especially since beaches, canyons, glacial lakes, ancient forests and mountain peaks are all within a few hours of each other in Montenegro. And no, that's not just in travel brochures, that's how it is in real life. Speaking of real life, let's take a look at what everyday life here is like. And yes, I'm talking about the economy. I know. Usually the word economy is the universal signal to check your phone or skip to the next chapter. But stick with me for a second. Because Montenegro's economic story isn't a dry spreadsheet. It's actually kind of wild. So, 2006, Montenegro was freshly independent, riding a wave of national pride, and then reality hit them like a ton of bricks. Because here's what the new country had to work with. 620,000 people, almost no natural resources, no major trade routes, and a GDP worth $2.7 billion. What it did have was that coastline, those mountains and all that natural beauty. So Montenegro made a decision. They pivoted to a boutique economy, which meant low taxes, light regulation, and an open arms policy for anyone with a big enough wallet. Essentially, this was what they're saying. Well, we can't outmuscle the giants, but we can overthrow them with our beauty. Yeah, something like that. And it worked. Over 14 billion euros, or about $17.5 billion, in foreign investment has rolled in since independence. And for a country smaller than Connecticut, that money turned a rundown naval shipyard into Porto Montenegro, now one of the most exclusive super yacht marinas on Earth. Billionaires also started showing up. 5-star hotels followed. Then luxury real estate developments popped up along the coast. Then 2020 happened, and we know how that went. GDP collapsed by over 15%, which at the time was one of the sharpest drops in Europe. Turns out when your entire economic model is built on a framework of rich foreigners come here and spend money, a global pandemic that grounded all flights was less of a setback and more of an existential crisis. Good thing there was a bounce back, but they had to learn this lesson the hard way. You can't run a country purely on beaches and good vibes, and Montenegro was slowly getting the memo. So what did they do? Investment spread into renewable energy, logistics and digital infrastructure, which meant the sell the view to oligarchs era was slowly disappearing, giving way to something better. And that's something better, that's the European Union. Currently, Montenegro is the undisputed frontrunner in EU accession talks. All 33 negotiating chapters are open, and already 14 of them are closed. The goal now is 28 by 28, becoming the 28th EU member by 2028. If they pull it off, that'll be a game changer. Bigger market, better investment, higher standards. And yes, harder rules. So some of the freewheeling days will be over, but at least the upside is huge. And for a country that started with nothing but rocks and a dream 20 years ago, that's a hell of a comeback that can be incredibly beneficial for its people. Which is the perfect segue for this section. Because you've got to understand that everything we've covered, from the centuries of resistance to the mountain fortresses to the refusal to be swallowed by empire after empire, all of that didn't just shape a country. More importantly, it shaped a character. And that character has a name in Montenegro. They call it Čojstvo I junaštvo. It translates to humanity and courage. But it goes deeper than that. In fact, there's an old saying here by Marko Miljanov, which goes like this: bravery is to defend yourself from another, and the humanity is to defend the other from yourself. Basically, it's the difference between being a tough fighter and being a good man. Anyone can swing a sword, but only a person with true character knows when to keep it hidden. And this code of integrity and self-sacrifice is baked into the culture, which is, in the most literal sense, a greatest hits of its history. You'll taste it in the food, like the Ottoman baklava sitting next to Italian-style bread and fresh Adriatic seafood. You'll hear it in the music, especially with the ancient haunting sound of the guzela, which is a single-stringed instrument used to recite epic poetry about battles and heroes. You'll also see it in the architecture. Just look around and you'll be amazed by Byzantine monasteries, Venetian stone towns, and Ottoman traces living side by side. But above all, you'll see it in their faith. Montenegrins follow an orthodox belief that combines different practices. So there's the Cetinje monastery, which held the line against Islamization for centuries. Then there's the Slava tradition, where families gather every year to honour their patron saint, with feasting and prayer. You see where I'm getting at? It's one thing to look back at your past and try to erase all the bad things that have happened. It's another thing completely to look at it in a different light and make something good out of it. And that's exactly what the Montenegrins did. So if you enjoyed this video, you'll love this next one.